The air in Unit 734 was a precisely calibrated lie. Recycled, scrubbed of all organic particulates, and chilled to a constant 19 degrees Celsius, it tasted of nothing. It smelled of nothing. It was the perfect atmosphere for a man who was also a lie. Elian moved through the space with an economy of motion honed over a decade of brutal self-discipline. His existence was a sequence of silent, measured actions within the white-walled containment of his living unit and the grey-walled monolith of his work sector. Every breath was a risk calculated, every heartbeat a variable monitored. He was an archivist for the consortium, a cataloguer of fragmented data streams from the pre-consortium era, a time of chaotic, unfiltered emotion that was now studied with the detached curiosity of a biologist examining a fossil. His work required precision, an absolute lack of sentiment, and it was a role he performed with unnerving flawlessness. His performance metrics were consistently in the 99th percentile. He was a model citizen, a perfect beta. This was his greatest, most necessary deception. The suppressant patch, a translucent polymer film adhered to the skin just below his collarbone, was a marvel of biochemical engineering. It leached a steady, microdosed cocktail of hormonal inhibitors into his bloodstream, silencing the volatile genetic code that screamed beneath the surface of his skin. It flattened his pheromonal signature, rendering him scentless, neutral. It was his shield, his cage, and the architect of the profound, hollow ache that lived in the marrow of his bones. He was not a beta, he was an omega, a classification deemed a systemic liability, a relic of a less orderly biology. In the consortium's grand design, omegas were either sterilely integrated into breeding programs, human incubators for genetically optimized assets, or permanently neutralized. Elian had evaded both fates through a combination of forged medical records, black market suppressants, and a will of forged steel. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a ghost haunting the edges of a system that would erase him if it ever truly saw him. Tonight, the silence of his unit felt different. It felt thinner, stretched taut over a low, unfamiliar hum. The vibration was almost imperceptible, a resonant frequency that traveled not through the air, but through the ferro-concrete of the structure itself. It came from Unit 735, the adjacent space that had been vacant for 3 standard cycles. A new occupant. Elian stood before the synth steel panel that served as his kitchen, the nutrient paste dispenser humming its usual quiet tune. He paused, his hand hovering over the activation plate. He closed his eyes, extending his senses, a dangerous habit he rarely allowed himself. The vibration was not mechanical. It was organic, inconsistent, a floorboard creaking under a heavy, deliberate tread, the soft thud of a box being set down, a sound like the rustle of natural fabric, not the slick whisper of consortium-issued synthware, a deep, slow breath. The sound was so faint it was more a pressure change against his eardrum than an audible noise. But he heard it. He heard it with a part of himself he kept locked away, the part that felt the pull of the moon and the shift of the seasons, the part the suppressants were designed to deafen. A tremor, fine as a spider's thread, traveled up his arm. He clenched his fist to still it. His own biometrics, displayed on the cool glass of the kitchen panel, remained stable. Heart rate 62 BPM. Core temperature 36.8 ODAG. Pheromonal output 0.01 parts per million. Nominal, all nominal. But the data was a lie. He could feel a warmth coiling deep in his belly, a sluggish, dangerous thing awakening from its chemically induced slumber. His cycle was approaching. The suppressants were designed for perfect control, but biology was a stubborn, chaotic variable. Sometimes it pushed back. He forced himself to dispense the nutrient paste, a beige, odorless substance that provided all necessary caloric and vitamin requirements. He ate standing, his gaze fixed on the shared wall, a seamless expanse of white that suddenly felt as thin as paper. Who was in there? Occupancy assignments were handled by the central algorithm, optimized for social harmony and minimal interaction. Residents rarely saw one another, their schedules staggered, their paths through the building's sterile corridors designed to never intersect. Privacy was not a right, it was a function of efficiency. Yet this new presence felt loud, intrusive, its sheer vitality a disruption to the calculated emptiness of his world. He could feel the weight of it, the solid, grounded stillness of the person on the other side. Later, as he prepared for his designated sleep cycle, the sounds continued. A low, melodic humming, deep in the chest, the sound of a human voice expressing something other than data. It was not a song he recognized, but its structure felt ancient, elemental. It vibrated through the wall and into his bones, and the warmth in his gut tightened into a knot. He placed a hand over the suppressant patch, pressing down as if to force its contents more deeply into his system. The skin beneath was cool, numb. He was fine. He was in control. He lay on the sleep platform, the room's light fading to a prescribed level of darkness. The air circulator whispered its monotonous rhythm, but beneath it, he could still hear the faint, persistent signs of life from next door. A sigh, the soft click of a terminal being powered down, the slow, even cadence of breathing. Deep, untroubled breaths that seemed to pull the very air from his own lungs. He was an archivist. He dealt in ghosts, in the echoes of a dead world. But the man in Unit 735 was not an echo. He was a living, breathing reality, and his proximity was a threat Elian could not quantify. For the first time in years, the silence of his unit was not a comfort. It was the held breath before a storm. The lie he had so carefully constructed felt fragile, and through the cracks, a terrifying primal truth was beginning to emerge. He wasn't safe. He was not alone, and the slow, steady rhythm of the breathing through the wall was a countdown. The workspace was a cathedral of silence, its vaulted ceilings and polished chrome steel surfaces designed to absorb sound and emotion with equal efficiency. Rows of archivists sat in ergonomic pods, their faces illuminated by the cool blue light of their data streams. Here, Elian was not a man. He was a function, an extension of the system. His pod was his sanctuary, the flow of information, a river in which he could drown the anxieties that gnawed at him. He was passing fragmented social logs from a pre-consortium metropolis, tagging emotional indicators for systemic analysis. Joy, grief, rage, love. They were all just data points, color-coded and filed away. He was methodical, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, his mind a cold, analytical engine. But today, the engine sputtered. The ghost of a scent teased the edge of his perception. Ozone and wet earth. Petrichor. His own scent, the one he had not smelled since his final conditioning at age 16. It was impossible. The work sector's air filtration was absolute. His suppressants were at maximum efficacy. He paused, his fingers hovering over the interface. He took a slow, deliberate breath through his nose, analyzing the air. Nothing, just the sterile metallic tang of the scrubbers. It had been a phantom, a sensory hallucination, a side effect of the low-grade stress he had been feeling since the new neighbor arrived. He flexed his hands, forcing the tension from his shoulders, and returned to his work. But the phantom lingered. A memory, potent and unwelcome, surfaced. A training room, white and featureless. A facilitator, a calm beta with eyes like chips of ice, explaining the inherent volatility of the Omega genome. "Your biology is a liability," the facilitator's voice echoed in his memory, smooth and devoid of judgment. "It invites chaos. It disrupts productivity. The consortium provides a solution, a path to stability. Your cooperation is not requested, it is required." He remembered the first injection of suppressants, the cold fire that spread through his veins, the feeling of a vital part of himself being extinguished, smothered under a blanket of chemical ice. He had not cried. He had not fought. He had simply gone numb, accepting that survival required this amputation of the soul. A red flag appeared in the upper corner of his display, a biometric alert. His heart rate had spiked to 84 BPM. He immediately initiated the calming sequence he had drilled into himself. A 4-second inhale, a 7-second hold, an 8-second exhale. He watched the number on the display descend. 81, 75, 68, 63. Back to nominal. But the effort left a fine sheen of sweat on his temples. He was losing his edge. The disturbance was no longer just a feeling. It was measurable data. He felt a gaze on him. He didn't look up. To do so would be to acknowledge the scrutiny, to betray his unease. But he knew who it was. Director Thorne, his immediate superior. Thorne was the epitome of the consortium's ideal, a high-functioning beta whose every action was governed by logic and efficiency. Thorne moved through the archives with a silence that was more unnerving than a shout, an absence of presence that somehow made him more noticeable. Elian kept his eyes on his screen, but his peripheral senses tracked Thorne's slow, deliberate path down the aisle. The director stopped 2 pods away, ostensibly to review another archivist's work, but Elian felt the focus of that cold, analytical gaze shift to him. He could feel the passive scan of his biometrics, the assessment of his work rate, the evaluation of his posture. He was a machine being inspected for defects. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Breathe in, 4. Hold, 7. Exhale, 8. The air in his lungs felt thick, heavy. The phantom scent of rain returned, stronger this time, and with it came a wave of heat that started in his chest and radiated outward. A hot flash, a classic preheat symptom. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of his control. He subtly shifted in his seat, trying to hide the tremor that had started in his left hand. Thorne finally moved on, the pressure of his observation lifting like a physical weight. But the damage was done. The fear was now a living thing inside him, gnawing at the foundations of his composure. He needed a booster. A risk, as unscheduled dosages were logged, but a necessary one. He completed his current data block, his movements stiff, and sent a request to his terminal for a 5-minute recess in a recalibration chamber. The request was approved instantly, the system's algorithm finding no reason to deny it. The recalibration chambers were small, sterile cubicles, antiseptic white and flooded with a flat, shadowless light. They were intended for mental palate cleansing, a brief sensory deprivation to enhance focus. For Elian, they were a place to maintain his lie. He locked the door, the hiss of the seal shutting out the silence of the archives. He leaned against the cool wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He pulled a small silver injector from a hidden pocket in his uniform lining. The emergency booster. Black market, untraceable, and brutally effective. He pressed the device against his thigh. The hiss of the pneumatic injection was followed by an intense, spreading cold. The chemical hit his system like a tidal wave, scouring him from the inside out. The heat receded. The phantom scent vanished. The tremor in his hand ceased. In their place came the familiar, hollow numbness. He felt scoured, empty. He was in control again. But as he stood there, breathing in the sterile air of the chamber, a new and more terrifying thought occurred to him. The phantom scent, the hot flash, they were not just random symptoms. They were a response. His body, his suppressed omega biology, was reacting to something. Or someone. An alpha. There had to be an alpha somewhere in the archives. But that was impossible. All alphas were assigned to enforcement, management, or other high authority roles. They did not work as archivists. Their pheromonal signatures were too dominant, too disruptive to the carefully maintained neutrality of the data sectors. Unless there was one who was like him, one who was hiding. The thought was so radical, so dangerous, that he almost dismissed it. But the evidence of his own body was undeniable. He was reacting. He finished his recess and returned to his pod, his face a mask of calm neutrality. But his mind was racing. He expanded his pod's passive sensory scan, a function meant to monitor ambient temperature and air quality. He repurposed it, tuning the sensitivity to its absolute maximum, searching for anomalous pheromonal readings. The system was designed to filter them out, to record them as environmental noise, but a trace, an echo, might remain. For the rest of the day, he worked with only half his attention, the other half dedicated to sifting through the sensory data of the entire sector. Nothing. The air was clean, sterile, uniform. He was chasing ghosts. As his shift ended, he powered down his terminal, the relief he usually felt replaced by a lingering dread. He walked through the silent corridors, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The system was perfect. The lie was perfect, but his own body was betraying him. That evening, back in the suffocating silence of Unit 734, the low vibrations from next door began again, the soft tread of feet, the rustle of cloth, and then a new sound, the quiet, rhythmic scratch of a graphite stylus on a physical medium. Paper. Someone was drawing or writing by hand. It was an archaic, inefficient, and deeply personal act. As he listened, a message appeared on his private terminal, the one he used for black market purchases. The sender was anonymous, the encryption absolute. The message contained only 5 words. Your rhythm is off. Be careful. The air left his lungs in a rush. The floor seemed to fall away beneath him. It wasn't a phantom. It wasn't a hallucination. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And the quiet, rhythmic scratching from the other side of the wall suddenly sounded like a clock, ticking down the last seconds of his life. Paranoia became the new architect of Ilian's existence. Every system, every interaction, every silent moment was now a potential threat. He recalibrated his life, tightening his already Spartan routines into a stranglehold. He ate less, slept less, and dedicated the stolen time to reinforcing his digital and biological firewalls. He ran diagnostics on his terminal, searching for spyware, finding none. He spent a small fortune in untraceable credits on a new series of suppressants, military-grade inhibitors that promised absolute nullification, but came with a list of debilitating side effects. The first dose left him with a blinding migraine that made the blue light of his datapod feel like a physical blow. He worked through the pain, his efficiency dipping by a statistically significant 2.3%. A notification, polite and automated, informed him of the deviation and recommended a nutrient supplement. It felt like a tightening leash. He saw the new neighbor only once in the following days. The encounter was as brief as it was unsettling. Elian was returning to his unit, his shift ending precisely on schedule when the door to 735 slid open. The man who emerged was tall, with a stillness that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the corridor. He was dressed in the standard grey synthwear of the residence block, but on him it looked less like a uniform and more like a temporary concession. His hair was dark, a little too long to be regulation, and his eyes, when they met Elian's, were a shade of grey that seemed to hold the cold depth of a winter sea. He was, by any objective measure, an alpha. The breadth of his shoulders, the quiet confidence in his posture, the almost imperceptible intensity of his gaze, it was all there. Yet there was no scent. None. Not the aggressive, territorial musk Elian had been conditioned to expect, nor the faint, telltale trace of suppressants. The air around him was utterly neutral. A void. It was more disturbing than any pheromonal broadcast. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of presence. Elian's training, his every survival instinct, screamed at him to lower his eyes, to make himself small and unnoticeable, the way an Omega was taught to behave in the presence of a dominant. He forced himself to hold the man's gaze for a fraction of a second too long, a tiny, reckless act of defiance. He inclined his head in a shallow, dismissive gesture and continued to his door, feeling the weight of that silent, grey-eyed stare on his back. He did not hear the door to 735 close until his own had sealed shut behind him. He leaned against the cool metal, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The man's scent wasn't neutral. Elian had been wrong. In that brief moment, as he passed, he had caught it. It was faint, almost subliminal, deliberately shielded, but undeniably there. It was not the sharp, aggressive scent of a consortium-bred alpha. It was something else entirely. Cold stone after a long rain. The clean, sharp scent of ozone in the air before a storm. Petrichor. The scent from his own sensory hallucination. The man next door, his name, according to the public residence directory, was Kale, was the source. The realization was a cascade of ice water through his veins. Kale was the alpha he had sensed. Kale was the one his body was reacting to. And if Kale was an alpha hiding in a residential block for betas, then he was just as much of a lie as Elian was. But what did that mean? Was he a threat? An enforcer from some clandestine internal affairs division sniffing out deviants? Or was he something else? The anonymous message echoed in his mind. Your rhythm is off. Be careful. A warning, not a threat. Was it possible Kale was trying to help him? The idea was so foreign, so contrary to the rigid hierarchy he understood, that his mind recoiled from it. Alphas did not help Omegas. They dominated, controlled, or claimed them. Trust was not a variable in that equation. The new suppressants were brutal. They plunged him into a state of sensory deprivation, muffling the world around him. Sounds became distant, colors muted. The nutrient paste tasted even more like nothing than usual. It was a state of living death, but it was safe. It silenced the traitorous responses of his body. It built the walls of his cage higher, thicker. Yet Kale's presence still managed to breach them. Elian could no longer hear the small, organic sounds from the next unit. The suppressants dulled his hearing, but he could feel the vibrations. The steady, rhythmic pulse of Kyle's existence was a pressure against the wall, a constant, low-frequency hum that his muffled senses interpreted as a kind of gravity pulling at him. One evening, he returned to his unit to find a small object on the floor before his door. It was a pot, no bigger than his fist, made of unglazed, reddish clay. In it was a plant, a succulent, its thick, fleshy leaves arranged in a tight, geometric rosette. It was green, a deep, living, organic green. Elian stared at it, his mind struggling to process the sheer illegality of the object. All non-essential flora was forbidden within consortium habitats. Plants were inefficient, unpredictable. They harbored microbes. They produced pollen. They were a vector for chaos. His first instinct was to incinerate it in the unit's disposal chute. To possess it was a serious infraction, but he could not bring himself to touch it. He looked up and down the empty white corridor. There were no cameras here, only passive atmospheric sensors. He nudged the pot with the toe of his boot. It was solid, real. He knelt, his joints protesting the unaccustomed movement. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the tip of a leaf. It was cool, firm, and slightly waxy. It was alive. A wave of something hot and sharp washed over him, so potent it almost brought tears to his eyes. It was a feeling he could not name, a ghost of an emotion from a past he could not remember. He looked at the door to Unit 735. There was no doubt who had left it. This was a message, far more complex and dangerous than the first. It was a test, a gift, an accusation. He quickly scanned the pot for listening devices, for tracking beacons, for any hint of consortium technology. There was nothing. It was just a plant in a clay pot. With a surge of reckless adrenaline, he picked it up and brought it inside, hiding it behind the nutrient dispenser, where no passive scan would find it. The tiny, green, living thing in the sterile white box of his apartment was a bomb, and the man who had placed it there was holding the detonator. That night, another message arrived. Just one word this time. Breathe. Elian looked from the glowing text on his screen to the small, defiant succulent. He took a breath, a real one, deep into his lungs. The air still tasted of nothing, but for the first time he felt the promise that it could be something more. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut. But now it was joined by something else, something terrifying and wild and utterly unknown. Hope. The hope was a dangerous poison. It made the greyness of his world seem greyer, the silence more profound. It was a flaw in the code of his survival, a vulnerability he could not afford. He tried to crush it, to bury it under layers of logic and fear. The plant was a trap. Kale was a predator, playing a long, cruel game. The messages were a psychological operation designed to destabilize him, to force him into a mistake. He repeated these assertions to himself like a mantra, but the words felt hollow. The succulent sat in its hiding place, a silent, green rebuttal to his paranoia. He found himself checking on it, touching its leaves, even giving it a few precious drops from his water ration. It was an act of madness. It was an act of prayer. At work, the pressure from Director Thorne intensified. It was never overt. Thorne did not reprimand or threaten. He simply observed. He would materialize at the edge of Elian's pod, his presence a sudden drop in temperature, and review his data flow. He would ask quiet, pointed questions. Asset 734. Your error correction subroutines have increased by 0.8%. Is your attention being adequately allocated? Or the latency in your emotional tagging has increased by 12 milliseconds. Are you experiencing any cognitive dissonance with the pre-consortium source material? Each question was a scalpel, deftly inserted to probe for weakness. Elian answered with the placid, deferential tone of a model employee, his biometrics held in check by sheer force of will and the punishing efficacy of the new suppressants. But he knew he was failing. He was a machine with failing parts, and Thorn was the diagnostician, cataloguing every sputter, every grind of the gears. The side effects of the military-grade inhibitors were worsening. He was plagued by constant, low-level nausea. His sleep cycles were disrupted by vivid, fragmented nightmares he couldn't recall upon waking, though they left a residue of terror that clung to him throughout the day. In one dream, he was in a room of mirrors, and every reflection was of a stranger with desperate, pleading eyes. In another, he was drowning in an ocean of static, the sound of Kale's breathing, the only thing he could hear. The physical toll was becoming harder to hide. There were faint, dark circles under his eyes that even the unit's flattering, diffuse light could not completely conceal. His weight had dropped. The precision of his movements, once second nature, now required conscious effort. He was fraying at the edges. His approaching heat was a storm gathering on the horizon, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this time the suppressants would not be enough. The chemical walls were crumbling. He could feel it. The warmth in his core was no longer a flicker. It was a constant, low-burning ember that the inhibitors could dull, but not extinguish. His sense of smell, which should have been completely deadened, was beginning to return in sharp, disorienting bursts. He would catch the scent of the archive's ozone scrubbers, the faint metallic tang of his terminal's casing, the sterile nothingness of his nutrient paste, and underneath it all, a constant, subliminal hum of petrichor and cold stone that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the building. Kale. He was everywhere, a ghost in the machine of Elian's senses. The final anonymous message came on the eve of his cycle's predicted onset. He was in his unit, staring at the succulent. He had moved it to the small ledge by the room's single sealed window, a panel of polarized glass that showed a simulated, perpetually pleasant sky. The system is designed to break, so are its cages. Elian read the words, and something inside him, a lock he hadn't known was there, clicked open. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a test. It was an offer, an ideology, a declaration of rebellion. Kale was not an enforcer. He was the opposite. He was a saboteur, and he was inviting Elian to light a match. The next morning, it began. It did not start with a bang, but with a slow, inexorable tide of heat. It began in his feet, a pleasant warmth that crept up his legs, settling deep in his bones. By the time he reached his pod at the archives, the warmth had reached his core, a molten pool of liquid fire in his belly. The suppressants were failing. He could feel them being consumed, burned away by the rising fever of his own biology. His skin became hypersensitive. The smooth, cool surface of his ergonomic chair felt abrasive, the synth fabric of his uniform a cage of sandpaper. The blue light of his screen was an agony, each photon a needle in his eye. He tried to work, to lose himself in the cold, clean logic of the data streams. But the pre-consortium logs he was archiving were suddenly, horrifically vibrant. A fragment of a personal message, tagged for familial affection, bloomed in his mind not as data, but as a wave of gut-wrenching love and loss. A public broadcast about a protest, tagged civic unrest, filled his ears with the roar of 1,000 angry voices. The emotions of a dead world were flooding him, and he was drowning. He smelled it before he felt it, fully. Ozone, rain, and something else. Something sweeter, muskier. The scent of an Omega in distress. His own. Panic, stark and absolute, seized him. He had to get out. He had to get to a recalibration chamber. He sent the request, his fingers fumbling on the interface. Request denied. He sent it again. Request denied. A new message appeared on his screen, this one not from an anonymous source, but from Director Thorne. Asset 734. A sector-wide diagnostic is in effect. All recesses are suspended. Please remain at your station. It was a lie. He could see other archivists rising and leaving for their scheduled breaks. He was being singled out. He was being contained. Thorne knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew something was wrong. The heat intensified, becoming unbearable. It was a fever now, a fire consuming him from within. His thoughts fragmented. The neatly ordered shelves of his mind collapsed into chaos. The scent, his scent, was growing stronger, thicker, a cloying cloud of desperation. He was a walking biohazard in a sterile environment. Any moment, the atmospheric sensors would detect it, would flag the anomaly. Alarms would sound, enforcers would come. He would be taken, reclassified, his life over. He closed his eyes, his head falling forward against the cool glass of his screen. He could hear his own ragged breaths, the frantic, terrified rhythm of a trapped animal. This was it, the end of the lie, and in the roaring chaos of his senses, one thing became preternaturally clear. A low, steady vibration that cut through the noise. A rhythm, the sound of slow, deep breathing. A sound he had heard through a concrete wall. He wasn't hearing it with his ears. He was feeling it in his bones, in his soul. Kyle. Somehow, impossibly, Kyle was here, and he was calling to him. The fever broke, shattering the last of his control. His body was no longer his own. It was a vessel for a primal biological imperative he had spent his entire life denying. A low whimper escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal distress. He curled in on himself, trying to make himself smaller, to contain the inferno raging within him. The scent pouring off him was thick now, a desperate, sweet perfume of ozone and rain and longing. It was a scream translated into pheromones. His pod's internal sensors flashed red, a silent, damning accusation. An alert was likely already coursing through the system's veins, heading straight for Director Thorne's terminal. It was over. He was caught. A soft chime sounded through his private comms, a channel no one, not even Thorne, should have been able to access. A voice, low and calm, resonated not in his ear, but directly in his mind, a phenomenon he had only read about in classified documents on alpha-omega resonance. "Elian, walk out, now." The voice was Kale's. It was not a command, but a lifeline. They haven't sealed the sector yet. They are observing, not acting. Protocol dictates they confirm the anomaly before. Containment. You have a small window. Go to the service elevator, West Corridor, code 9 Delta 7. Elian's mind, fractured by pain and fever, seized on the instructions. It was insane. To walk out now, in this state, was to reveal himself to everyone. But to stay, was certain capture. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, his vision swimming. The cathedral of silence was no longer silent. To his hypersensitive ears, the low hum of the servers was a roar, the soft clicks of terminals a volley of gunshots. Every head was turned toward him. Every eye was on him. Or was it just his imagination? He couldn't tell. He took a step out of his pod, then another. He walked, his gait stiff and unnatural, down the central aisle. He did not look at the other archivists. He did not look for Thorn. He fixed his gaze on the far end of the hall, the image of the West Corridor Service elevator, a burning sigil in his mind. He could feel their stares. He could feel their confusion, their suspicion. He could smell the faint, acrid scent of their muted curiosity. Betas, all of them. Their senses were dull, but his scent was so strong now that even they must be noticing something. A strangeness in the air, a disruption to the perfect, sterile equilibrium. He reached the end of the aisle. West Corridor. He turned left. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His skin felt like it was on fire. Each step was an agony. He could feel his own pheromones clinging to him, leaving a trail like breadcrumbs for the wolves that would surely follow. "You're almost there," Cale's voice echoed in his mind, a steady anchor in the storm. "Don't run. Walk. Keep your rhythm steady." The service elevator was a plain, unmarked chrome steel door. He reached it, his hand shaking so badly he could barely press the keypad. 9 Delta 7. The numbers swam before his eyes. He stabbed at them, his finger leaving a damp smudge on the pristine surface. The door hissed open. He stumbled inside, collapsing against the far wall as the door slid shut, plunging him into darkness. The elevator did not move. It was a trap. Of course, it was a trap. He had walked right into it. He slid down the wall to the floor, curling into a tight ball, waiting for the lights to come on, for the enforcers to appear. Instead, a hand touched his shoulder, firm, warm, and steady. He flinched violently, a choked cry escaping him. The lights came on, but they were not the harsh, clinical lights of the consortium. They were a soft, warm amber. Kyle was kneeling in front of him, his grey eyes filled with a calm, focused intensity. The elevator was not an elevator. It was a small, shielded maintenance node, hidden from the building's main schematics. "Breathe, Elian," Kale said, his voice as calm and steady as his touch. "You're safe for now." Elian stared at him, his mind unable to reconcile Kale's presence with his reality. The scent in the small space was overwhelming. His own desperate, sweet smell, and Kale's. Petrichor, and cold stone, but stronger now, deliberately projected. It wasn't aggressive or dominating. It was grounding. It wrapped around him, a shield of scent that seemed to push back against the chaos in his own system, calming the storm. "How?" Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm a divergent," Kyle said simply, as if that explained everything. "We've been watching you for a long time. Your pheromonal signature, even suppressed, is unique, powerful. We suspected you had the potential to break your conditioning. There are others, a network. We exist in the cracks of this system. We learn to control our biology, not to erase it. We can shield our sense, create false data trails, communicate on frequencies the consortium can't monitor." He reached out and gently brushed a damp strand of hair from Ilian's forehead. The simple, non-threatening touch was so unexpected, so contrary to every horror story he'd been told about alphas, that it broke something inside him. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "The messages, the plant, I had to know if you were reachable, Kale said, his voice softening. I had to know if there was still someone inside the perfect machine. The system is designed to break people like us, Elian, to turn us into tools or livestock. I was offering you another option. The full-blown heat crashed over him then, a wave of such intensity that the world dissolved into a blur of pure sensation. His body arched, a pained gasp tearing from his throat. The need, the raw biological imperative for a knot, for a bond, for the claiming bite of an alpha, was a physical agony. He had read about it in forbidden texts, but the reality was 1,000 times more savage. He looked at Kale, his vision blurred with tears and fever, and the instinct to submit, to offer his throat, was so powerful it was almost impossible to resist. But Kyle made no move to claim him. He simply held his ground, his scent a steady, calming presence. He was not a predator. He was a sanctuary. I'm not going to hurt you, Kale said, his voice a low murmur. I'm not going to take anything from you. I'm going to help you through this. I'm going to show you how to be free. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small grey pouch. From it, he took a dried leaf and crushed it in his palm, the scent of something sharp and clean, like mint and pine, filling the small space. He held it out to Elian. Chew this. It will not stop the heat, but it will clear your head. It will give you back your mind. Elian stared at the offered leaf, then back at Kale's steady grey eyes. Trust was a foreign concept, a word from a dead language. But in this moment, trapped between the sterile, murderous control of the consortium and the unknown chaos of freedom, he had no other choice. With a trembling hand, he took the leaf. The cage was broken. What lay outside, he did not know. But for the first time, he was not facing it alone. The herb was bitter, its sharp medicinal taste a shock to his system. But as he chewed, a cool clarity began to spread through the fever fog of his mind. The savage, overwhelming need did not vanish, but it receded, becoming a manageable ache rather than an all-consuming fire. He could think again. He could observe. He was still himself, a consciousness separate from the storm raging in his body. Kale had given him back his own mind, an act of grace so profound it left him breathless. They remained in the maintenance node for what felt like hours. Kale sat with him, a quiet, solid presence in the small, amber-lit space. He did not press, did not interrogate. He simply held the space, his controlled pheromones, a constant, soothing balm against the sharp edges of Elian's heat. He spoke in low tones, explaining the nature of the divergent network. They were not a violent resistance, not a revolutionary army. They were archivists of a different sort, preserving the parts of humanity the consortium sought to erase: emotion, instinct, biological truth. They built sanctuaries, rescued those who were breaking, and taught them how to integrate their secondary genders into their identities rather than fighting them. The consortium teaches that your nature is a weakness, a flaw to be controlled, Kale explained, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. They believe that stability can only be achieved by sanding down every sharp edge of what makes us human. We believe true strength comes from embracing those edges. Your heat is not a sickness, Elian. It's a source of power. You just haven't been taught how to wield it. He guided Elian through a series of breathing exercises, techniques that felt both alien and deeply familiar. He taught him to follow the waves of the heat, to ride them instead of fighting them. He showed him how to focus the intense sensory input, to use it to expand his awareness rather than be overwhelmed by it. For the first time, Elian felt a flicker of control that was not born of suppression, but of acceptance. He could feel the building around them, the hum of its life support, the flow of data through its fiber optic veins, the faint, anxious energy of the archivist in the sector he had fled. And he could feel Kale, a steady, warm presence, his calm heartbeat a rhythm to which Elian could anchor his own. The intimacy of the moment was staggering. It was not sexual, not possessive. It was deeper than that. It was the quiet, profound connection of two souls who had recognized the same truth in a world built on lies. He learned Kale's story in fragments. He had been born in one of the outer zones where the consortium's control was less absolute. He had been identified as an alpha early, but his family were part of the network and had taught him shielding and control techniques from a young age. He had infiltrated the central city, a sleeper, his mission to identify and extract high-potential divergence, like Elian before the system could break or reclaim them. "Your scent signature is remarkable," Kale said, his gaze distant. "Even through the strongest suppressants, we could detect it. A resonance, like a clear, high note in a room full of static. We knew your breaking point was coming. I was sent to be here when it did." A chime from Kyle's wrist comm broke the quiet. He glanced at it, his expression hardening slightly. "Thorn has initiated a Level 3 containment protocol on your floor. They've sealed the residential block. They found your pheromonal trail leading from the archives." Elian's blood ran cold. "My unit, the plant—" "I retrieved it," Kale said. "It's safe, but they'll be sweeping the units. Thorn is methodical. He'll find traces of your presence, discrepancies in the atmospheric logs. He'll know you haven't simply vanished. He'll assume you have an accomplice." The sanctuary of the small node suddenly felt like a tomb. They were trapped. "What do we do?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We use the chaos," Kyle replied, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous in his grey eyes. "The consortium's greatest strength is its reliance on its own systems. When you disrupt the data, you disrupt their control. Thorn thinks he's a hunter, but he's just following a script. We're going to write a new one." Over the next hour, Kale worked from his comm, his fingers flying across a holographic interface that shimmered in the dim light. He was a ghost in the machine, a virtuoso of digital sabotage. He cloned Elian's biometric signature, creating ghost signals that appeared and disappeared in random locations throughout the vast complex. He triggered minor annoying system malfunctions in other sectors, a flickering light grid in hydroponics, a temperature fluctuation in the administrative wing, a series of false positives in the water reclamation system. All small, insignificant events on their own, but together they created a tapestry of systemic noise, a blizzard of false data that would tax the central processing core and, more importantly, distract the human element. "Thorn prides himself on his focus," Carl murmured, his eyes never leaving the data stream. "I'm giving him 100 new things to focus on." As Kale worked, Elian focused on what Kale had taught him. He closed his eyes and breathed, extending his senses. The heat was still a powerful force, but it was no longer a blinding pain. It was a lens. He could feel the subtle shifts in the building's power grid as Kale diverted energy. He could sense the patrol patterns of the automated security drones that had been deployed in the archives, their movements precise, predictable, and utterly devoid of intuition. He was no longer just an archivist. He was a sensor, his Omega biology a finely tuned instrument of perception. "They're starting the sweep of the residential block," Elian said suddenly, his eyes still closed. "I can feel the change in the floor's energy signature. 4 enforcers, moving from the top down." Kyle looked up from his work, his expression one of mild surprise and deep approval. "Good. Your senses are coming online. They'll reach our floor in approximately 28 minutes. Our window is small, but it's there. The system will be undergoing a full diagnostic reboot in 35 minutes. For 90 seconds, all internal security sensors and automated protocols will be offline. That's when we move." "Move where?" "To the undergrid, the old service conduits, the veins of the city the consortium paved over but never fully eradicated. It's our way out." The plan was audacious, insane. But as he looked at Kale, at the calm certainty on his face, Elian felt not fear, but a strange, exhilarating thrill. He was a fugitive. He was a deviant. He was a creature of chaos in a world of perfect order. He had spent his life in a cage, terrified of the monster he was told he carried inside him. But now, in the dark, with a quiet alpha who smelled of rain, he was beginning to realize it wasn't a monster at all. It was a key. The 35 minutes were the longest of Elian's life. The small node, once a sanctuary, now felt like a compression chamber, the pressure building with each passing second. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythmic anchor Kyle had given him. But the proximity of the approaching enforcers was a palpable threat. He could feel their heavy, methodical tread through the floor plates, a dull, percussive beat that vibrated in his teeth. They were methodical, sweeping each unit with portable atmospheric sensors and biometric scanners. They were hunting for the ghost he had left behind. Kale had finished his digital sabotage and was now perfectly still, his eyes closed, his posture one of relaxed readiness. He was conserving his energy, a predator waiting for the precise moment to strike. The air in the node was thick with their combined sense. Elian's fading but still potent heat, a high, clear note of ozone and desperate sweetness, intertwined with Kale's steady, grounding scent of petrichor and stone. It was a scent of quiet defiance, of a secret shared in the dark. 5 minutes to reboot, Kale said, his voice quiet but clear. He opened his eyes, and they were sharp, focused. When the reboot hits, the lights in the corridor will flicker and switch to a low-power emergency red. The magnetic locks on the doors will momentarily disengage. The drones will freeze in place. We'll have 90 seconds. That's it. The hatch to the undergrid is 14 meters down the corridor, behind a maintenance panel. He looked at Elian, his gaze direct and serious. "I can mask our approach, create a dead zone around us, but your senses are sharper right now. You'll be our guide. Can you feel where the enforcers are?" Elian closed his eyes, sinking back into that state of heightened awareness. The heat, which had subsided to a low burn, flared slightly, sharpening his senses like a whetstone on a blade. He could feel them. 4 distinct presences. They had just finished sweeping Unit 732. They were moving towards his own unit, 734. "They're 2 doors down," he whispered, moving slowly, systematically. "And Thorn?" Kale asked. "Where is he?" Elian searched for that specific signature, for the cold, meticulous vacuum that was Director Thorn. He found him. Not with the enforcers, but stationary, at the main intersection of the corridor, watching the data feed from the sweep on a handheld terminal. He was the spider at the center of the web. "He's at the junction," Elian reported. "Waiting." "Of course he is," Kale said, with a faint, grim smile. "He trusts his tools, his system. He doesn't expect the prey to move. Stay with me, Elian. When I move, you move. No hesitation." The countdown felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to Kale's calm, steady rhythm. This was it, the leap into the unknown. A quiet, synthesized voice echoed from Kyle's comm. "System-wide diagnostic reboot commencing in 10 seconds. 9. 8. Kyle rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, pulling Elian up with him. He placed a hand on the small of Elian's back, a point of firm, reassuring contact. 7. 6. 5. Kyle pushed the release on the node's door. It was now unlocked, ready to be opened. 4. 3. 2. Elian could feel the building's power grid tense, preparing for the switch. 1. The lights in the node flickered and died, replaced an instant later by the faint crimson glow from the corridor. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the structure as the main systems went offline. "Now," Kale breathed. He pushed the door open, and they slipped out into the red-drenched corridor. The air was still, silent. The automated drones were frozen mid-patrol, their optical sensors dark. The 90-second clock had started. They moved quickly, their soft-soled boots making no sound on the polished floor. Kale's pheromonal shield was a tangible thing, a bubble of warped air around them that smelled of nothing at all. But Elian could feel Thorn. The director had looked up from his terminal, his head tilted, sensing a disruption, not with technology, but with some cold, vestigial instinct. He couldn't see them, but he knew something was wrong. "He feels us," Elian whispered, his voice tight. "Keep moving," Kale ordered. The maintenance panel was flush with the wall, almost invisible in the dim red light. Kale pressed a sequence of points on its surface, and a section of the wall slid away with a soft hiss, revealing a dark, gaping hole and a steel ladder descending into blackness. "Go," Kyle urged, pushing Elian gently towards the opening. Elian swung his legs over the edge and started down the ladder, the cold metallic rungs biting into his hands. He could smell the air from below, damp, earthy, and alive with the scent of decay and growth. It was the smell of the real world. He heard a voice from the end of the corridor, amplified by the silence. It was Thorn, calm, collected, and utterly chilling. "Asset 734, your biological signature is irregular. A reclamation team has been dispatched. Please remain stationary for recalibration." The voice was a lie. There was no reclamation team. It was a psychological tactic, an attempt to make them freeze. Kyle was already on the ladder behind Elian, pulling the panel shut above them. A heavy thud echoed through the shaft as the magnetic locks of the building re-engaged. They were in. They were safe. But as the panel sealed them into the darkness, Thorn's final words, no longer amplified but still audible through the steel, followed them down. "Flag assets for retrieval. Mark as volatile." The hunt had just begun. They had escaped the sterile cage of the consortium, but they had just entered a much larger, darker, and more dangerous world. The 90 seconds were over. They were fugitives. Elian looked down into the oppressive darkness, then up at the silhouette of Kyle above him. He was terrified, but as he took another step down the ladder into the damp, breathing dark, He felt Kale's hand briefly rest on his shoulder, a silent promise in the abyss. He was not alone. The undergrid was a labyrinth of forgotten infrastructure. Massive corroded pipes wept condensation, and bundles of ancient fiber optic cables, long since decommissioned, hung from the low ceiling like dead vines. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, rust, and something else, a faint organic musk that was the scent of a city's hidden, decaying life. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault after a lifetime of sterile, recycled air. For Elian, whose senses were still raw and heightened from his heat, it was almost unbearable. But it was real. It was the first real air he had breathed in over a decade. Kale produced a low-lumen glow rod, casting a small pool of soft, white light around them. He moved with a quiet confidence, his steps sure-footed on the slippery, uneven floor. He was at home in this darkness, in this place of forgotten things. "The consortium fears this place," Kale said, his voice low, not wanting it to carry in the echoing tunnels. "They see it as a relic, a source of contamination. For us, it's a lifeline, a network of pathways that runs beneath their entire city, invisible to their senses." They walked for what felt like hours, the only sounds the drip of water and the soft scuff of their boots. The initial adrenaline of the escape began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Elian's body, battered by the heat and the suppressants, screamed in protest. The low-grade fever returned, and a tremor started in his hands. He stumbled, his legs giving way. Kyle caught him before he hit the ground, his arm a strong, steadying band around Elian's waist. "Easy," Kyle murmured, guiding him to sit on a dry section of a large pipe. "You've been running on adrenaline. Your body needs to recover." He knelt in front of Elian, studying his face in the dim light of the glow rod. "The worst of the heat is over, but your system is still in shock. The suppressants, they do more damage than the consortium admits. They create a war inside you. You're feeling the aftermath of that battle." Kyle opened a pack and took out a water pouch and a dense, nutrient bar. It wasn't the tasteless paste of the consortium. It smelled of nuts and dried fruit. The taste was revelatory, an explosion of flavor on Elian's deadened palate. As he ate, a profound sense of dislocation washed over him. Everything he had known, his job, his home, his carefully constructed identity, was gone. He was nothing but a name, a fugitive designation in a consortium database. He was Asset 734, marked as volatile. "What happens now?" he asked, the words feeling heavy and strange in his mouth. "Now, we get you to safety," Kale said. "There's a sanctuary, a way station, about 2 more hours from here. You can rest there, recover, and then you'll have a choice to make." "A choice?" "You can stay with us," Kale explained. "Learn what we know, learn about yourself. Or we can help you get to the outer zones, give you a new identity, and let you disappear. The choice will be yours. We don't force anyone. Freedom has to be chosen." Freedom. The word was so large, so abstract, it barely had any meaning. His entire life had been about the opposite: control, confinement, the careful management of every impulse. The idea of a future that was not predetermined, not optimized by an algorithm, was both exhilarating and terrifying. They continued their journey, Kale now keeping a slower pace, his hand often hovering near Elian's back, ready to steady him. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer tense or suspicious. It was comfortable, companionable. In the shared darkness, Stripped of their former roles, they were just two people, two deviants, finding their way. Elian found himself observing Kale, noticing the small details he had missed before, the way he moved, with the efficient grace of a predator, but with none of the aggression. The way his eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to see everything. The quiet intelligence that radiated from him. He was a paradox, an alpha who protected rather than dominated, who guided rather than commanded. He was unlike anyone Elian had ever known. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, a new light became visible ahead. Not the cold, white light of a glow rod, but a warm, flickering, yellow light. And with it came a new sound, the low murmur of human voices, the clink of metal on stone, and the smell of roasting vegetables and wood smoke. They had arrived. The sanctuary was a vast, cavernous space, an old subterranean water cistern, the ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. A fire pit burned in the center, casting dancing shadows on the curved brick walls. A small community of people, perhaps 24, were gathered around it, talking, working, eating. They were a mix of ages and genders, but Elian could sense, with his newly awakened perceptions, that they were all like him and Kale. Divergence. An alpha woman with silver hair was sharpening a blade, her scent like pine and winter air. A young Omega man was sketching in a notebook, his pheromones a subtle, gentle fragrance of chamomile and honey. A beta couple was quietly mending clothes, their presence a calm, steady anchor in the sea of stronger scents. No one was hiding. No one was suppressed. Their scents mingled in the air, creating a complex, layered perfume that was vibrant and alive. It was chaotic. It was beautiful. A woman with a kind, weathered face and the sharp, clean scent of cedar looked up as they approached. She smiled at Kale. "You found him," she said, her voice warm. "He's safe now." Kyle nodded, his hand resting briefly on Elian's shoulder. "Elian, this is Mara. She runs this way station." Mara's eyes, a warm, intelligent brown, met Elian's. She didn't offer a hand, didn't invade his space. She just looked at him with an open, accepting kindness that felt more foreign than anything else he had experienced. "Welcome, Elian," she said. "You look exhausted. Come, we have food and a place for you to rest. You're among friends here." Friends. Another word from a dead language. Elian looked around at the faces in the firelight, at the quiet, purposeful activity of this hidden community. He saw no fear, no suspicion. He saw weariness, yes, and a certain watchfulness. But he also saw resilience. He saw life. This was the chaos Director Thorne feared. It wasn't violence or anarchy. It was just people, living authentically, their sharp edges intact. It was family. Elian was given a small private alcove carved into the brick wall of the cistern. It contained a simple cot with a thick woolen blanket and a small, flickering oil lamp. After a lifetime of sterile white walls and regulated lighting, the space felt impossibly cozy, a haven of warmth and shadow. Mara brought him a bowl of hearty vegetable stew and a mug of hot, herbal tea. The food was simple, but rich with flavors he couldn't name, and it warmed him from the inside out. For the first time, he felt the gnawing tension in his shoulders begin to release its grip. He slept for 16 uninterrupted hours, a deep, dreamless sleep that was more restorative than any consortium-mandated sleep cycle. When he woke, the fever was gone. The tremor in his hands had ceased. The ache in his bones had subsided to a dull memory. He felt quiet. The war inside him was over. He emerged from his alcove, to find the cistern in a state of quiet daytime activity. The central fire was now a bed of glowing coals, used for cooking. People were cleaning tools, sorting supplies, reading from physical books. The young Omega he had seen the night before, whose name he learned was Ren, was teaching a small child how to tie a complex knot. The scene was so peaceful, so domestic, it was hard to reconcile with the fact that they were all fugitives, living in constant danger. He found Kale near the cistern's main entrance, a massive sealed gate, studying a series of hand-drawn maps laid out on a crate. He looked up as Elian approached, a faint, welcoming smile touching his lips. "You look better," Kyle observed. "I feel—" Elian struggled for the word. "Clear." "That's what it feels like when you stop fighting yourself," Kyle said, turning his attention back to the map. "Thorn has locked down the entire district above us. Roving patrols, biometric checkpoints. He's tearing the place apart looking for you." The news sent a chill through Elian, but it was a distant fear now, not the immediate, suffocating panic he was used to. "He thinks I'm a weapon," Elian murmured, remembering Kale's words. "A powerful Omega signature." "He thinks you're a contagion," Kale corrected gently. "A flaw in his perfect system that might spread. An idea with a scent. And in a way, he's right. Every person we pull out, every mind we free, is a crack in the foundation of their control." In the days that followed, Elian began to find a new rhythm. He was not given a job or a function. He was simply allowed to be. He helped with small tasks, chopping vegetables, cleaning water filters, standing watch. He spent hours talking with Mara, who told him stories of the world before the consortium, a world of vibrant, messy, beautiful chaos. He learned from Ren, the young Omega, who taught him not to fear his own senses, but to explore them. Ren showed him how to differentiate the individual sense of the people in the cistern, how to read their emotional states from the subtle shifts in their pheromones. It was a language Elian had never been allowed to speak, and he was a surprisingly quick study. He learned that his own scent, the one he had always feared, was not just ozone and rain. When he was calm, it smelled of fresh soil and new leaves. When he was focused, it had a sharp, metallic edge, like flint. He was not one thing. He was a spectrum. His most important lessons, however, came from Kyle. They spent hours together, often in comfortable silence, sitting near the entrance, listening to the sounds of the city above. Kyle taught him the basics of shielding, of controlling his pheromonal output, not by suppressing it, but by consciously directing it. It was like learning to control a muscle he never knew he had. "It's not about being scentless," Kale explained one afternoon, his voice a low murmur. "It's about choosing what you project. You can be a stone, a shadow, a whisper. You can create a wall of calm or a field of misdirection. Your scent is a tool, a voice." Under Kyle's patient guidance, Elian began to practice. He learned to pull his scent inward, wrapping it around himself like a cloak until he was almost undetectable. He learned to project a thin, neutral scent, a passable imitation of a beta. It was exhausting, requiring immense concentration, but it was also empowering. He was no longer a victim of his biology. He was its master. The bond between them deepened, evolving from one of rescuer and rescued to something more balanced, more profound. It was a connection built on shared understanding, on the quiet recognition of the scars they both carried. Elian found himself drawn to Kale's stillness, to the deep well of calm that seemed to reside within him. Kale, in turn, seemed to find a quiet satisfaction in watching Elian slowly, cautiously, unfold. One evening, they were standing watch together. The cistern was quiet, most of its inhabitants asleep. "You have your choice to make soon, Elian," Kyle said, his gaze fixed on the darkness of the tunnel. "We have a transport leaving for the outer zones in 3 days. You could be on it. A new name, a new life. You would be safe." Elian thought about it. The idea of safety, of true anonymity, was a powerful lure. He could disappear, leave the fight behind, and build a quiet life for himself somewhere the consortium's reach was weak. But as he looked at Kale's profile in the dim light, at the quiet determination etched on his features, he knew it was an empty promise. Safety was just another kind of cage. "And what would you do?" Elian asked. "I stay," Kyle said simply. "There are others like you still trapped up there. My work isn't done." Elian looked away from Kale, out into the oppressive darkness of the tunnel that led back towards the city. He thought of Director Thorne, of the sterile white rooms, of the millions of people living lives of quiet desperation, their true selves buried under layers of conditioning and chemicals. He thought of the person he had been, a ghost, a lie, slowly dying in a cage of his own making. "I'm not an archivist anymore," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to just file away the past. I want to help build a future." He turned to face Kale, his gaze steady. "You said my senses are powerful. You said I'm a contagion. Teach me how to use them. Teach me how to be a weapon." A slow smile spread across Kale's face, transforming his usually stoic features. It was the first time Elian had seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "I was hoping you'd say that," Kale said. He reached out, not to touch Elian, but to gently cup the air a few inches from his face, as if weighing his scent, his resolve. "Your rhythm is steady now." "I know," Elian replied, a confidence he had never felt before rising in him. He let his shield drop just for a moment, and released his own true scent, ozone and rain, soil and flint, into the air between them. It was not a scent of distress or of need. It was a statement, a declaration of who he was. Kale met it with his own, the scent of petrichor and cold stone, a quiet, solid acknowledgement. In the darkness of the undergrid, their scents intertwined, a silent, binding promise. The hunt was not over, but now they were no longer the prey. They were the hunters. The next 3 months were a period of intense transformation for Elian. The divergent community became his school, and its members his teachers. He learned to navigate the undergrid by sound and scent, to distinguish the echo of an active sewer line from that of a hollow, abandoned conduit. He learned to purify water, to identify edible fungi that grew in the damp dark, to set simple traps for the mutated rodents that scurried through the tunnels. He learned the practical, gritty skills of survival that the consortium had deemed unnecessary for its coddled citizens. His body changed. The soft, sedentary physique of an archivist hardened. His senses, no longer dulled by suppressants, sharpened to a preternatural degree. He could hear the faint electrical hum of the city's power grid through meters of rock and concrete. He could taste the mineral content of the water. He could smell the approach of a patrol drone from 100 meters away. But the most profound change was internal. The fear that had been the constant companion of his life was replaced by a quiet, focused anger. It was not the chaotic,
destructive rage of the pre-consortium era he had once archived. It was a cold, clean anger, the anger of a person who has seen the bars of his cage and has resolved to dismantle it, piece by piece. Kyle was his primary mentor. He was a patient but demanding teacher. He pushed Elian's control over his pheromones to its absolute limit. They practiced in the deeper, more remote tunnels, where Kyle would create complex scent drills. He would project the aggressive, territorial scent of a panicked alpha, and Elian would have to hold a shield of perfect calm. He would create a scent ghost, an illusion of a person moving down a side tunnel, and Elian would have to track it. "Your biology gives you an advantage Thorn can't comprehend," Kyle would say, his voice echoing in the dark. "He fights with data and machines. We fight with the one thing he has tried to eliminate, instinct. He can't predict it because he doesn't believe in it." Elian discovered he had a particular talent for mimicry. He could sample a person's pheromonal signature and, with concentration, project a faint, imperfect copy. It was a remarkable skill, one that even Kyle, for all his control, could not replicate. "It's the archivist in you," Kyle noted one day, a rare hint of amusement in his voice. "You're used to cataloging and replicating patterns. You're doing the same thing, just with a different kind of data." The bond between them solidified into a seamless partnership. They developed a non-verbal communication, speaking volumes with a shared glance, a subtle shift in scent, a slight change in posture. Elian learned to read the minute signs of tension in Kyle's shoulders, and Kyle learned to recognize the flicker of uncertainty in Elian's eyes. They moved as one, their strengths and weaknesses perfectly complementing each other. The quiet intimacy that had begun in the maintenance node blossomed in the shared darkness of the undergrid. It was a slow, tentative thing, expressed not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet moments. Kale would bring him a rare phosphorescent mushroom he had found, its soft blue light a thing of beauty in their dark world. Elian would save a portion of his ration for Kale when he returned, exhausted from a long scouting mission. One night, as they sat together, cleaning their gear after a particularly grueling training session, Elian's hand brushed against Kale's. Neither of them pulled away. Kale slowly, deliberately, turned his hand over and laced his fingers through Elian's. His touch was warm, his grip firm, but gentle. It was not a gesture of possession, but of connection, of partnership. They sat in silence for a long time, their hands clasped between them, the quiet hum of the cistern the only sound. In that touch, Elian felt a sense of belonging, of being truly seen, that he had never known. It was more profound than any chemical bond, more permanent than any alpha's claiming bite. It was a choice, freely made in the dark. Their first mission together was a simple one: reconnaissance. A new type of biometric scanner was being installed in one of the central transit hubs. The network needed to know its capabilities. The plan was for Kale to create a digital diversion, drawing the attention of the enforcers, while Elian, cloaked in the scent of a neutral beta, would get close enough to allow a small, palm-sized device to analyze the scanner's emissions. They moved through the undergrid, emerging through a ventilation shaft into a grimy service corridor behind the transit hub. The transition from the earthy dark of the tunnels to the sterile, brightly lit world of the consortium was a shock. The air was thin and tasted of metal. The noise was a dull, oppressive roar. Elian felt a flicker of his old fear, the instinct to make himself small and invisible. Kale placed a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe,"
He murmured, "You are a stone. You are a shadow. You are nothing they are looking for." Elian closed his eyes, centered himself, and molded his pheromonal output. He became the perfect, scentless, unnoticeable beta, just another drone in the hive. He could feel Kyle's presence, a steady warmth at his back, before Kale slipped away to initiate the diversion. Elian merged with the sparse, late-night crowd, his movements calm and deliberate. He was just a citizen on his way home from a late shift. He was a lie, but this time it was a lie of his own creation, a weapon of his own choosing. He approached the scanner bank, his heart a steady, slow drum. He could see the enforcers, their polished armor gleaming under the harsh lights. He could smell their faint, suppressed alpha scents, the scent of antiseptic and authority. They were alert, but their attention was focused on the far end of the hub, where a series of station announcements had begun to malfunction, broadcasting pre-consortium poetry in a loud, booming voice. Kyle's diversion. Elian walked past the new scanner, his hand holding the analysis device, brushing against its casing for a fraction of a second. It was enough. He continued walking, not too fast, not too slow, and disappeared back into the service corridor. He met Kale at the rendezvous point. The Alpha was leaning against a wall, a look of calm satisfaction on his face. "Did you get it?" Kale asked. Elian held up the small device on which a green light was blinking steadily. "It's more than a biometric scanner," Elian said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a genotyper. It's not just identifying people. It's classifying them. It can detect suppressed secondary genders." Kale's expression hardened. "Thorn is escalating. He's not just hunting for you anymore. He's building a better cage for everyone." They retreated back into the darkness of the undergrid, the small, blinking green light, a beacon of terrible news. Their victory felt hollow. They had succeeded in their mission, but they had discovered that the enemy was more dangerous, more insidious than they had imagined. They were no longer just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been told they were a liability, a mistake, a flaw in the system. The war was just beginning. The discovery of the genotypers sent a ripple of alarm through the divergent network. It was a paradigm shift. The fragile safety of suppression and forged documents was about to be obliterated. Thorn was methodically eliminating the cracks in the system where people like Elian had been able to hide. The sanctuaries of the undergrid were safe for now, but if the network couldn't find a way to move people out of the city, they would become prisons. The mood in the system grew tense. The quiet, domestic peace was replaced by a low hum of anxiety and urgent planning. More scouting parties were sent out, mapping escape routes, testing the security of the city's perimeter. The news was grim. Security was being tightened everywhere. Thorn was turning the city into a fortress. It was during this time of escalating tension that Elian's role truly began to crystallize. He was not a fighter like Kale, nor a strategist like Mara. He was something new. His unique sensory abilities, combined with his archivist's mind for patterns, made him an unparalleled intelligence asset. He could sit in the darkness of a ventilation shaft miles from the cistern and build a detailed picture of the world above. He could track patrol routes, identify security blind spots, and even sense the emotional state of the enforcer crews, their boredom, their alertness, their fear. He became the eyes and ears of the resistance. He and Kale became an inseparable unit. Kale would handle the physical, infiltration and technological sabotage, while Elian provided sensory overwatch, a ghost in the machine, whispering warnings and guidance into Kyle's comm. They developed a reputation within the network as the Whisper and the Shadow. Their successes were small but significant. They helped a family of divergents escape their residential block moments before a genotype sweep. They identified and disabled a shipment of new model surveillance drones. They planted false data in the consortium's central servers, creating phantom deviants in other districts to draw Thorne's attention away from their own operations. With each mission, Elian grew more confident, more attuned to his abilities. The Omega biology he had once seen as a curse was now his greatest strength. He was not just using it, he was embracing it. He was becoming the weapon the consortium had inadvertently created. But the strain was immense. The constant state of high alert, the pressure of holding the lives of others in his hands began to take its toll. He grew leaner, harder. The last vestiges of the soft archivist burned away. There were new, sharp lines around his eyes. He rarely smiled. The cold, clean anger that drove him was a demanding fire. Kyle watched him with a quiet, growing concern. He saw the toll the fight was taking. He saw the way Elian pushed himself, forgoing rest, sacrificing his own well-being for the sake of the mission. One night, after a particularly harrowing operation where they had nearly been caught, Kale confronted him. They were in a small, temporary safe house, a forgotten storage room deep in the undergrid. Elian was hunched over a terminal, analyzing the data they had retrieved, his body thrumming with residual adrenaline. "You need to rest, Elian," Kale said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm fine," Elian snapped, not looking up from the screen. "We got the data. I need to find the pattern." "The data can wait. You can't keep burning the candle at both ends. You'll burn out." "I won't," Elian insisted, his voice tight. "I can't. If I stop, if I miss something, people will get caught. People will die. It will be my fault." Kyle moved to stand behind him, placing his hands on Elian's tense shoulders. He began to gently knead the knotted muscles, his touch firm and grounding. "It is not all on you," Kyle said softly. "You are part of a network, remember. We are all in this together. You carry your share of the burden, not all of it." Elian let out a shuddering breath, the tension in his body fighting against Kyle's touch. He wanted to resist, to insist on his own strength, but the simple, unwavering kindness of the gesture broke through his defenses. He leaned back against Kale, the rigid control he maintained over himself finally cracking. "I'm so tired," he whispered, the admission a painful, ragged thing. "I know," Kyle murmured, his hands never ceasing their steady, soothing rhythm. "I know. Rest now. I'll stand watch." Elian finally allowed himself to surrender. He let Kyle lead him to a cot in the corner of the room. He lay down, and Kyle pulled a rough blanket over him. Kyle didn't leave. He sat on the floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, a silent, watchful guardian. Elian reached out a hand from under the blanket, and Kyle took it, his fingers lacing through Elian's. As he drifted off to sleep, his last conscious thought was of the profound, unshakable safety he felt in Kyle's presence. This connection, this quiet, fierce love that had grown between them in the darkness, was the one thing the consortium could never touch, could never understand. It was the ultimate act of rebellion. It was the source of their strength. They knew that Thorne would not stop. He was a zealot, a true believer in the consortium's vision of a perfect, orderly world. He would continue to build his cage, making it stronger, smarter, more inescapable. The final confrontation was inevitable. They were on a collision course, two opposing ideologies, two different definitions of what it meant to be human. And Elian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that when that day came, he would be ready. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a whisper that could start an avalanche. And he had a shadow at his side.